Good afternoon, everyone. I appreciate everyone being here for our short version of what administrators need to know about special education. Let me just check in. I'm going to check in with you, Matt, to make sure that you are seeing both my screen and my video, or my video, meaning my face.
Yeah, I can see both. It looks good.
Okay, something went kind of crazy on what I'm seeing, so I just want to make sure.
Okay, we're all good.
Well, I appreciate everyone being here. My name is Angie McKinney, and I'm one of the technical assistance specialists with the IEP Technical Assistance Center, formerly known as the Indiana IEP Resource Center. So if you have done any work with the Resource Center in the past, we're the same folks doing the same work pretty much. And I'm here with Matt Johnson, who is going to be the master of the chat. So if you have questions along the way, because this is so much information really crammed into an hour and a half, I would like you to use the chat to post questions. We can play a little stump the chump here and see what Matt knows. So please feel free to drop questions in there. If it is a question that is clarifying something that I am talking about, then Matt, please interrupt me and we'll make sure everyone gets clarification. Otherwise, I'll just look to Matt to answer questions within the chat if it's a little off topic or expanding on a topic and won't interrupt the flow of what we're talking about. So I'm going to jump right into our short agenda for today. First of all, we are going to talk a little bit about some things that you need to know in order to stay as compliant as possible. Nobody ever wants to be out of compliance because that usually brings with it kind of a whole host of issues from potential complaints, due process issues, to things related to being out of compliance for state or federal requirements, which may not result in a complaint, but might result in a whole lot of paperwork. So we want to make sure that you know what you need to know in order to try and stay as compliant as possible. And within that, we're going to talk about the notice of procedural safeguards. Then we'll hit some key timelines that we feel like administrators really need to be on top of. You may not actually be doing the work of getting those timelines met, but making sure that you understand what those timelines are so that you can support your staff is really important. And then some different timeline and considerations for implementing the IEP. So we'll talk about those things as well. Then we'll jump into a little bit related to the IEP meeting itself. And then finally, we'll wrap up with talking about things related to behavior and the so fun manifestation determination meeting. So we'll talk about what that looks like and some things that you need to know related to that. So I want to start by sharing, Matt has uploaded a link, and Matt, if you could do that again, now that we have a few more people on here, a link to the handout itself. But if you go to this particular QR code or link, you can use either. This will take you to a Padlet of information that contains resources that you can print, videos that you can watch, books that you can look into, all sorts of things. And it does include the PowerPoint for our full day session of this. So again, you're only getting the hour and a half version, but if you want to see all of the information that we share with folks during our day-long training, you can find that in the very first column of the Padlet. So let's jump right in with some compliance related things. And we're going to start with that notice of procedural safeguards. There are a number of places within Article 7, so within Indiana special ed law, that they talk about written notice. And written notice can mean a lot of things. One of the things that it talks about is the notice of procedural safeguards or parent rights. And part of what the law requires is that we put that information in writing. and in writing in a way that parents can understand it and parents can read it. So it's in their native language, or it's shared in a way that they have it. They can actually physically take it and try to make sense of it with our support. It's kind of hard for us to make sense of it sometimes because there's a lot of legal terminology in these documents. There are other places where written notice actually means like an invitation to a conference, or putting a refusal in writing, or putting a permission form in writing, or giving the IEP in writing. So this is just one of many things that is talking about written notice. So within the notice of procedural safeguards, or parent rights is usually what we refer to, there are a lot of things that it talks about. And this is certainly not comprehensive, but a few things that are in there are things like, hey, mom, dad, we're going to be putting things in writing when we want to do something that's different, when we want to change something. We're going to put it in writing when we invite you to conferences. And we are always going to invite you to conferences. We're going to get consent before we do testing. We're going to get consent before we do that initial placement if it's appropriate. You have the right to look at your child's record. You have the right to ask for an independent evaluation anytime that we do one that you're not happy with, or not, you don't feel like it's accurate. There are so many more things that are included in parent rights. But one of the things that we do sometimes is we just slide those parent rights across the table and say, here is another copy of your parent rights. Do you have any questions? And we kind of get this deer in the headlights look from most parents who say they don't know what to ask, right? It's really important that we're actually sharing key information. Now, we give a copy of these parent rights at some key times. So one of the things that the law says is that we have to offer it at least once a year. We're giving these to the parents, and that, we're explaining these things. But there are also some other times where it's required by law, and it's important that you, as the public agency representative or as the building administrator, really know what these things are. So we always give a thorough explanation and a copy of these at that initial request. So whether it's a school request or whether it's a parent request, we're going to give a copy of those rights before we do anything, because it's really important that parents are informed. We also have to give another copy at the first filing of a complaint or due process in a school year. Now, we hope if we ever get to that point, and nobody wants to be at that point, that you only have one, that you don't have multiple during a school year. But if you did have another one, you do not have to give another copy of parent rights at that time. Number 4 is one that is really important for many of you, because some of you are in that role where you might be handing down disciplinary consequences to students. And we will talk about this here in just a little bit when we get into manifestation determinations. But on the date that you hand down discipline that would result in a disciplinary change of placement, meaning we're going to tip across that 10-day line where we're eventually going to have a manifestation determination meeting. On the date that we hand down that discipline, we have to give another copy of that notice of procedural safeguards. So it's really important that you keep a stack of these in your office, so that if you happen to be sending home any of those discipline letters that are going to take us to that point, that you are actually giving that copy of the parent rights at that time. And then the last one is just anytime a parent asks, we give another copy. No hesitation, no questioning. Yes, I've given you 20 in the last year, but you want another one, we're going to give you another one. Absolutely. You can put these on your website, but that actually doesn't count as providing that written notice. It is definitely advisable to put your parent rights right there where anybody can access them at any time, but it doesn't serve as providing that. All right, so if we're going to explain these, You have to know how to explain them. Um, I mean, again, Article 7 doesn't say you need to give a verbal explanation, but it says that parents have to be, if they're consenting to anything, they have to be providing informed consent. And I know if I were in the parent's shoes, I don't feel informed unless I understand what I'm signing on for. So making sure that we have a way to explain those parent rights is really important. Um, I would encourage you to develop a little elevator speech. So I know the cooperative that I used to work for, our director had kind of a little cheat sheet that everyone would get that we didn't give out to parents because this was for staff to be able to understand what are some key things that we need to go over when we're talking about parent rights. And so we may talk about, you know, the information is confidential. We're not going to share this outside of our school unless your child moves without your written consent. That we're always going to invite you to meetings, that it's going to take your consent to get this started in the first place, that we're going to always let you know in writing if there are things that we want to change or things that you ask for that we're going to refuse. So some of those things are really important. I think another thing that's really good to share with people as kind of part of this elevator speech is that there are a lot of things in parent rights that tell you what to do and what your rights are when you are not happy. But the first thing that you should always do is contact somebody at the school. Contact your child's teacher of record. Contact the building administrator. Contact the special ed director. We want to work it out with you. We want to come to resolution. But if those things are not getting you where you need to be, you do have the right to file a complaint or to ask for mediation or to file for due process. So I think if we just share that piece without saying, hey, please contact us first, we may end up with some things that we don't want. So we want to share that we're actually a team and that parents are always part of that team. All right, a little bit about timelines, and there are so many timelines within Article 7, and it gets a little confusing because some things are based on instructional days and some things are based on business days. And business days are kind of defined as a Monday through Friday that does not have, that is not a holiday. So, you know, even if we're not in school, if it's a Monday and it's not a holiday, that would be counted as a business day. So we'll talk about some of these different timelines and what you need to know about that. Some of the main ones are around the testing that we do when we have an evaluation, how we respond to that initial request that comes from a parent for the evaluation process, holding meetings, putting the IEP in place, and then also those move-in conferences. Right now is the season of the move-in conference, as you all have gotten started. Hopefully most of those are wrapped up, but even at the beginning of the year, we still have a lot of kids that are still moving in from different districts. And then we'll get some throughout the year as kids move. So let's start with that initial referral. Now, when a school makes a referral for an evaluation, there's no real timeline for that. We get together, we share concerns, we have some meetings, but there's no real timeline that says within so many days you've got to get some paperwork out. It's just basically saying that as part of the child find obligation that we have to identify students with disabilities, get on it, get moving with those things. But it is definitely different when we get a parent referral for that initial evaluation. And actually, this applies really to reevaluations as well. So when a parent makes a request, they can make it verbally or in writing. Now, we always prefer in writing, but we don't always get that, right? We sometimes will have a parent who maybe even mentions to the classroom teacher at a parent-teacher conference, hey, I really think I want to have my child evaluated. That is a request. That triggers a timeline, which means that is day zero. This applies to any licensed personnel that you have in your building. So not special ed licensed, but if you've got a teaching license of any kind, you are a certified person. And any request now triggers that timeline. So it's really critical that your staff all understand that. Typically, we want to have a meeting with that parent if we can. The law doesn't say anything about having to have a meeting, but most of the time, if you get a parent request and you haven't made that request as a school, you may not know exactly why the parent is requesting this. So it's good to get that information. We have to respond to that request within 10 instructional days. So those are days that we are at school and we've got kids there. And we have to do this in writing. Now, it's really important that we use either the permission form, that would be one piece of writing that we could respond with, to say, yes, we agree, let's do some testing. And we give them a permission form that says, here's all the data we used, here's what we suspect based on what we've talked about, and here's what we propose to do. Or we respond with a notice of refusal, which says, here's all the data we used, and we don't think this needs to happen, right? But it's really important that we use one or the other of these from the system because they include some very specific information that is required by law. So just sending an email or a letter home to the parent is likely to not have everything that is needed within that written document. So that's why we want to make sure and use the actual forms from the system. Sometimes you will have those requests that a parent maybe didn't really mean that they wanted a special education evaluation. Either a doctor has said, hey, go ask for this, or they're just looking for help. And so sometimes we have those conversations with a parent after they've made the request, and we talk about some of the great interventions that are going on at our school, and a parent says, that's great, let's do that instead. If that is the case, it is still absolutely critical that you use the notice of refusal, because if you don't, you have not responded in writing to that actual request. All right, now once we do sign a permission form, yet another piece of written notice that we have, that triggers more timelines. So once we get consent for an initial evaluation, the timelines could be different based on the different types of evaluations that we have. So most of our initial evaluations need to be completed and a case conference held to determine eligibility within 50 instructional days. Now, there are a couple of exceptions to this. One, I hate to even talk about because most people don't use it, and it is very, very likely being removed from the law once the Article 7 revisions get accomplished. It's on the docket to be taken out of Article 7, and that's a 20-day evaluation when a student has been within that response to intervention or MTSS process and has basically collected data along the way, and the team has already decided if they don't hit a certain point by a certain date, we're going to be referring for an evaluation. We're supposed to do those within 20 days. However, again, very rarely do I see anyone use this, mainly because most places don't feel like they've got the right data by the end of that intervention process. But again, it is very likely to be removed from the law. The second is a situation where while I am either suspended or expelled, an evaluation is requested. And in those cases, we really want to speed up that timeline. We need to get those done within 20 instructional days because a student may be sitting at home during that time. And we want to make sure that we get all of this accomplished so that we can really know what's going on with the student prior to making any long-term decisions. Because the longer we wait, the longer they have been out of school. And then that final situation is for our little bitty kiddos. So when a student has a plan through first steps. They're receiving early intervention services during that period of birth to 3. As they get close to that 3rd birthday, the expectation is if we still suspect a disability that would be covered, then they need to be evaluated. We need to hold a conference, and we need to have a program that's ready to start on their 3rd birthday. So sometimes we actually started a little bit earlier just to make sure that we have everything in place. All right, reevaluations are pretty similar. We respond to those requests within 10 days that come from a parent, and we can actually refuse a reevaluation request when it is not appropriate, when we don't have a need for the data. Most of our reevaluations need to be conferenced within 50 instructional days. And basically it's, if we need to do something quickly, we're going to add something, we're going to remove something, we need the information to be able to figure out what to do on the IEP, then those need to be done within 50 days. We sometimes will have a request just for an update. We just want to determine, that a child's still eligible and we get an update because they haven't been tested in a lot of years, those kinds of things. In those cases where we're not expecting big changes, then we can do that by the next annual case review. So from whenever during that year-long cycle that we get the permission form signed, we will meet on the information by the next annual case review. And you actually determine this when you're completing the reevaluation permission form. So that is decided up front. Some other things that have some timelines attached related to those initial evaluations. One is that a parent can request to have a copy of the evaluation report at least 5 days prior to the scheduled meeting that we have. So not less than 5 is what it says, which means 5 or more days before we need to get them a copy. Parents can sign and check the box on the initial permission form to say, yes, I would like this. They can also at that same time request a meeting to go over the evaluation results, not with the whole case conference, but with just somebody who can explain the information. And that needs to happen within 5 days prior to the scheduled meeting. So one is at least, or not less than, and the other is within. And typically those are meetings that are just a Zoom or a phone call or something like that for parents to be able to ask as many questions as they want without all of the audience. It gives them a chance to really figure some of this stuff out and maybe think about it a little bit before the case conference happens. Now, regardless of whether they've asked for this or not, I know most districts do their best to get a copy to the parent prior to the meeting, even when they don't request it. And I think that's a great practice. If that can't happen, we always have a copy right there at the meeting for them. And I would always bring this. Even if you've given a copy ahead of time, it's nice to have another copy there because many people forget to bring those kinds of things. And we can never charge for copies of the evaluation report. Now with reevaluations, gone are the days where we had to do testing every 3 years. And any of you who are as old as I am, probably not many of you left in education with that age, but we used to have to do testing every 3 years. Every 3 years, no matter whether we needed it or not. And now the law says at least every 3 years, we have to talk about it. We have to say, do we need new information? Do we have questions that we don't have data to give us the answers to? Now, for us, it gets even easier because the IEP system itself prompts you to have this discussion every year. So we're just never out of compliance for that because we're always looking at that information every year. And I think that's helpful. We generally write IEPs that last an entire year, a calendar year from the date that we meet on to the next year. However, Sometimes we write them for shorter periods of time. We can never write them for longer than 365 days, but we can write them for shorter periods. And I think sometimes for a parent, if they're just not sure about what is being proposed, they may be more likely to be comfortable with a shorter time period, knowing we're going to meet again and see how things go. But in general, I'd say, 99% of our IEPs are written for an entire year. We do have to review them at least annually, which is why we have those annual case review meetings. And then another timeline is that we have to provide information to the parents about the progress the student is making toward their goals, at least as often as we give report cards. So if you give report cards every 9 weeks, then parents should also be getting an update as to how students are doing toward their IEP goals. If everyone gets midterms, and I know that's not the case for most schools, you get midterms when things are going wrong, but if all your students get a midterm report, then they should also get an update on their IEP progress as well. Move-ins. All right. So when you get a new student comes to your door, the first thing we do is usually ask, do you have an IEP? Have you had any special education? You ever had a 504 plan, right? We ask some of these things, and most of the time we get accurate information. We get a parent who says, yes, they had an IEP for this, and then we pull in the information and everything's great, right? We sometimes get parents who say, nope, when they certainly did. Right? And sometimes that answer of no is because a parent is hoping for a fresh start for a student. If we move, I'm just not going to tell them that my child has a disability. And this is usually when it's behavior, that they're hoping that this move will fix everything, and maybe it will, right? But probably not. In those cases, you don't really know, right? If you've got a kid who's coming from within Indiana, it's very likely that you'll see that information come up when they get pulled into the system. But what I would encourage you to do is, number one, have your school secretaries know to use some varied language, because the terminology that's used in different buildings can be different, whether they ever say the term IEP, special education, whether they just use the term resource, special supports, right? There are a lot of things that people will use to kind of tip around some of that. And if you ask the right questions, sometimes you will actually get the information. Okay, so the first thing that you need to do, if you believe for any reason that the student has an IEP, is number one, enroll them right then. Don't send a student away and say, come back when we have a copy of your IEP. Come back when we're ready for you. We're going to take them and we're going to give them the best that we can based on what we know about them and based on what we have until we can make some changes. So we're going to enroll them right away and give them the services that we can. And then we've got a 10 instructional day period to actually gather data, hopefully get a copy of that IEP, and hold a conference to make some changes, or just say this IEP is beautiful. We're just going to implement it exactly as it is. We're going to go ahead and accept that IEP. And most of the time you're going to make some minor changes, because we all do things a little bit differently, even when we are providing kind of some comparable services. It just may look a little bit different, and that's okay. But we have to do all this within 10 days. Now, many times when we get an IEP, that IEP can be from 10 months ago or 6 months ago. So it's always important to gather data within that 2-week period so that you truly have some present levels, because 10 months, 6 months, even 3 months is really not present anymore, especially after a student has moved. So make sure that your teachers know to do some little informal assessments to figure out exactly what's going on, where this kid is at currently. Now, it's always fun when somebody comes to us and they're mid-process of evaluation, whether it's an initial evaluation or a reevaluation, it really doesn't matter. We still have to take a look at where were they in the process, where are we in the timeline, and can we make it happen? The expectation is that if you can make it happen within the original timeline, we do it, right? It's in the best interest of the student to get that completed and make sure that we're using the data to make whatever changes that we need to make. However, sometimes we get kids that come to us on day 48 with nothing done. And those are situations where we may need to negotiate a new timeline with the parents. So we have to sit down and have a conversation about, how long do we think it's going to take in order to get this done? I think sometimes I've seen kids that have moved into a new district, and a lot of things have been done, but maybe we're missing things like rating scales. Rating scales are tricky because most of them have a requirement that whatever person, whether it's a teacher or somebody else that is completing those kind of rating scales, has to know the kid for a period of time. So it's not like you can give me a new student tomorrow and say, hey, can you fill out a BAS? Can you fill out an ABOS? I can't do that yet until I've really gotten to know the student. So sometimes that can extend our deadlines a little bit too, when some of that needs to be completed. Or you may want to have your psychologist or speech pathologist or whoever is involved reaching out to the previous district to say, hey, you had this kid for like a couple of years. Could you fill this out and send it to us? Which would probably be more accurate information. So the big thing for you all as administrators is, number one, just keeping your eye on these things, right? Knowing which timelines are which so that you can monitor them. Because if your staff start missing some of these key timelines, we got to get to the why. We have to dig back in and see, do we have some unnecessary steps happening that's keeping people from meeting the timelines? Is somebody not being informed of what they need to do, and so we're dropping the ball on something? There could be a lot of reasons behind that, and that's where really good processes and procedures and practices all come into play. Sometimes it's really important to have certain staff in key roles too. The keeper of the paperwork, or the person who logs in certain requests so that we can make sure that they all get done on time, or assigning certain things out to different staff members. If you are part of a cooperative, you may have very specific procedures that filter kind of through the cooperative. If you are an individual school corporation, you may have your own policies and procedures that are helping to support those things. But even within your individual buildings, it's important to see, are these things flowing? Are we doing everything that we need to? Okay. Got a few more timeline issues related to implementing the IEP. And so before I mentioned that written notice is one of those terms that's just used over and over and over again. Part of written notice is actually the IEP. So when it says we need to provide written notice after an IEP meeting, it means giving a finalized copy of an IEP. So one of the things that it's really important to know, because this is one of the things, and I don't have a slide on this, but you may want to write this down. The IEP itself, finalized, again, I can't emphasize that enough. Never give a draft after an IEP meeting. We sometimes will use draft IEPs prior to an IEP meeting, at the IEP meeting, so we have something to look at. But after that meeting is completed, when we give a copy of the IEP to the parent, it needs to be a finalized copy, not a draft for review. And we have to do that within 10 business days of the meeting. And I think that's where we sometimes get a little tripped up because we're so used to working on instructional days. But this has to go to the parent within 10 business days, which means if we have those meetings right before Christmas break, right um, before summer, before fall break, all of those kinds of times where we may be out of school for a while, the clock continues to tick away, even though we're not at school. So we have to make sure and get those finalized and home to the parent. They have to receive it before 10 business days is up. Now, we're going to go into a little bit of the implementation piece now. So with an initial IEP, we have to get the services in place no later than 10 days after we get consent to implement. So the first time that we offer an IEP, the very first time that you're being evaluated, we've determined, yes, you're eligible. We write this beautiful plan and we give it to the parent. We can't do anything service-wise until we actually get written consent from the parent. So they got to sign off on that IEP. Now, once they do, most of the time, I mean, I see some names on here I recognize, and I know for most of you, once we get a signature, we're ready to go. We're starting the next day. We want to get things moving with this student. But there are some times when a student's situation is a little more complicated. We've got to arrange something that we haven't arranged before. Maybe we don't have another student that's similar to this, so it's not a matter of having things ready to go, or a student that we get that we meet and determine this student's going to need a paraprofessional to support them, and we don't have any extra people, right? So we've got to hire somebody. Or a student that comes to you that's deaf and hard of hearing, and maybe you don't have any other deaf and hard of hearing students in your building, and we need an interpreter. That takes a little bit of time. Well, we get about 10 days grace to be able to get all this kind of arranged. Now, for a student that is already in special education, it's a little bit different. So once we have a meeting and we offer a new finalized IEP, then we've got multiple timelines at play. So we have the meeting, we give a finalized copy within 10 business days. Now we wait 10 instructional days, which is an opportunity window for the parent to either let this IEP happen by letting those 10 days expire, basically. And on the 11th day, we are free to implement the new one. Or they could potentially challenge the IEP, or they could sign to have it implemented even sooner. Like, just let's get this started. And we have that happen sometimes, but there's no need for a signature unless that signature is about getting the IEP implemented sooner than that 11th instructional days after we give a finalized copy. I know that's just coming at you with all angles from timelines. I do want to emphasize here that the only legal challenges to that IEP when it's not an initial are to either request a meeting and participate in that meeting with somebody from the school who has the authority to facilitate the disagreement. So it doesn't mean I don't like this IEP and I want a whole new meeting. It means I don't like some parts of this IEP and I want to sit down with somebody, typically the director, could be the building administrator. It depends on what your local policies are around this. But it's just sitting down with, one person, maybe two people, and say, I don't like the wording of this goal. Can we work on it? I don't like this. Whatever the disagreement is, and try to work it out at that level. The second one is to initiate mediation. And the third is to request due process. Now that's it. These are the only ones. So a parent saying, I don't like this IEP and I'm not going to sign it. Well, you don't have to sign it, right? It still goes into place on the 11th instructional day after you've gotten it. A parent who files a complaint, they are still entitled to file that complaint, but it does not challenge the IEP. Only one of these things does. If an IEP is challenged, though, the student never is without an IEP. So we're still going to work off the most recent IEP before that we agreed on until we work out the differences. I think this is maybe the shortest sentence in Article 7. It says the IEP must be implemented as written. So really, what does that mean? It basically means do what you said you were going to do. Give the services, provide the accommodations that we agreed upon. You know, anything that we said, this is what the program is going to look like when we offered it and we all agreed, then that's what we need to do. Now, sometimes that's challenging, right? Sometimes we write an IEP and think, oh, what did I get myself into? I offered too much. The student didn't need that much. Well, doesn't matter because that's what we agreed on. It can be a challenge sometimes. I know a lot of you are struggling with staff shortages, maternity leaves, illnesses. You know, there are things that get in the way of implementing an IEP that are related to just staffing. All I can tell you is we do the best we can and we're constantly working to try and fix those issues. Documenting these things is really important. And I think transparency with the parent is really important. So even, you know, some of you may have experienced things like you lost your speech pathologist and you can't find another one and you're trying to contract, but you can't even get that organized. And so for a period of time, kids are going without speech. In those cases, again, document all your efforts, call those parents and say, hey, look, here's the situation. We'll make up for it as soon as we secure somebody. But in the meantime, we need you to know that your child is not getting this. I think that it does go a long way when you are open and upfront with parents. It prevents a lot of the complaints and the bad feelings when you try your best and just lay it all out on the table for them. Some other issues with IEP implementation can be things like not sharing all the information with some of the general education teachers. They didn't know they were supposed to provide read aloud. They thought all that happened down in the special ed room, right? So making sure everybody knows what their pieces are is really important. And as an administrator, I think it's really important to emphasize to all your staff that an IEP is a legal document. It is our promise of what we intend to do for a student. It's not a suggestion. It is a legal document. And I think sometimes when we have somebody who maybe is bristling at some of the stuff that's on an IEP, well, I don't allow that in my class. Well, you do for this kid because this is what we determined. If there's a big problem with that, come to the next IEP meeting and let's discuss it as a group. But the group decided, here's what we're going to do. So overall, when we talk about responsibility, most of this falls back on the shoulders of the teacher of record. And there are pages of stuff in Article 7 about what the responsibilities are for a teacher of record. They're tremendous. And they're not always doing the direct stuff for a student, but they're coordinating all of it and trying to make it all happen. So making sure that that all staff know what their responsibilities are, making sure the paperwork gets done on time, making sure the student services happen, all of those kinds of things. And I think sometimes we have teachers of record who are stretched so thin that they couldn't possibly get it all right. So thinking about how you can support your teachers of record, how you can make sure that they've got some prep time. Some of our special ed teachers get robbed of their prep time and they need it. They really do, because they're probably trying to collaborate with many general education teachers. It's really important that that person is appropriately licensed. That's a struggle too. We got a lot of people who are coming in with very little background in special education, and we're trying to get them up to speed as quickly as possible. And that is hard. That is really hard. Ultimately, though, even though they're shouldering all of these different things, the buck stops with you all. Because as a building administrator or a district administrator, if something doesn't happen, yes, they'll look to who dropped the ball, but they're also going to be looking to the administrator to say, did you not know? Right. And if you did know, why didn't you do something? Right. So the more that you have that aerial view of what's going on when it's related to special education, the better. I think another thing, I wish we had a time if we were all face to face that we could sit and have a good conversation about this. And you're welcome to put anything in the chat that you think is kind of part of your role as an administrator. Some of the things that come to mind for me is making sure you know like where all your people are, because I think sometimes coordinating that can be helpful in making sure that everything is happening. Having at least a sense of who all in your building has an IEP. For some of you that may be in very large buildings, that's hard, you know. Knowing what to look for when you go into classrooms. What should you look for when you go into a gen ed room as to see are these special services happening? Because they don't all happen in a special ed room. In fact, most students are getting most of their supports, whether it's accommodations, services, specially designed instruction. A lot of that is happening right in the general ed classroom. So as you do your walkthroughs, what should you be seeing? What should you be hearing? All of those kinds of things can be really important. But when you've got a better sense of, what should I even expect? How can I keep track of all this stuff? You're going to be able to make better sense of, is it actually happening or is it not? Part of what we need to look for in that implementation role too is thinking about the fidelity of any of our programs. So if we look at what does that really mean? Part of it comes from just, did we do it? But part of it can also be from, is the it good? So whatever services or supports that we have, are they matched up well with the student? Are they the right dosage to even have any impact for a student? Some of those things are really important. We don't just have programs for students with learning disabilities. We have programs that are designed around Johnny and Sally and Susie because their needs are all different. We don't have, this is our autism program, because I can tell you every student with autism is different. I don't care what the disability is. Find me two kids that are exactly alike and I'll give you some lottery money, because it's just not going to happen. Everybody is different. That's why we have individualized education programs, not generalized education programs. All right, just a little bit about case conferences. We all look forward to case conferences, right? Sometimes not. I mean, it really depends. But there's so many things that are involved in case conferences, and we want them to be positive meetings. So just starting with thinking about general etiquette, making sure that as the person who is likely in that role of a public agency representative, you are a required person when you attend meetings, which means you can't leave. You can't leave early because unless you have written permission from the parent. And we'll talk about this just a little bit more in just a minute. So not leaving, making sure that you're focused on the meeting. We're not focused on the phone or the computer. In fact, for most people, if you have a computer open, you should state your reason. I'm taking notes. I'm in the student information system. I'm working in the IEP. Anybody else should have that stuff closed down. Try to get a sense of who this kid is. A lot of you, when you're serving in this role, it's hard, right? When you think of your kids, right? It's the whole building. or for some of you, it's the whole district. So even getting a face to match up with a kid's name is difficult. And you want to be at least knowledgeable enough about the student to know what might be expected at this meeting. It may be a 30-second briefing with the teacher of record right before the conference starts to say, tell me, give me the deets on this kid, because I don't want to be blindsided by a request. I don't want to be blindsided by issues that I've not heard anything about. So tell me what to expect for this meeting. Now, can't always predict that that's the way it's going to go, but that it's going to arm you a little bit for that meeting. Making sure that you kind of take on that notice of procedural safeguards piece, or train your teachers to do a good job with this. And then also knowing that anytime that we write an IEP, it's always based on the student's needs. And that is hard, because sometimes we think, yeah, but we don't have that. Or, yeah, but boy, funds are tight. It has to be based on the student's needs. We don't have to give a catalog of services, but we do have to give, what's appropriate and what's reasonably calculated for the student to make meaningful progress. One of the things that you could really do, and I would insist on at your meetings, is that you always use an agenda. There is a sample agenda that's much, much shorter than this. We kind of use this to say, here are like all the possible things that you might be discussing at a meeting. But there's a short, very general agenda on the Padlet, as well as a set of ground rules. You can use any of that stuff that you find on the Padlet. But an agenda is great for getting us back on track, right? Because sometimes we start talking, I think this is the most common thing. We are a profession of problem solvers. And so our natural pattern is we hear an issue and we jump to solutions, just because that's what we do. But the IEP process takes us through a very deliberate set of steps to say, let's get a good picture of what's going on first. Now let's set some goals based on that information. Now let's determine the services and supports that are needed in order to get us from where the student started to where we want them to end. And if we jump out of order on those things, we're not really getting the best information. So an agenda can help just take us back to where we need to go, keep us focused on the IEP process itself. And it's sometimes very comforting, I think, for either a parent or somebody else in the meeting who just, they have something that is like the most important thing they want to talk about at this meeting. If they can see where it's going to happen, that you're not avoiding it, it's just that it happens a little later. That sometimes can be kind of comforting and calming to the meeting itself. Now, again, I mentioned before, if you all are serving as a public agency representative, you would be a required member. And there are some key roles that are pretty much always required. And then there are some specific situations where other people are required members. But then we also have additional people that we invite into meetings that are not required. And so they can kind of come and go without needing to have official written excusal. So we need parent excusal for the public agency representative, the teacher of record, the general education teacher, the instructional strategist, who is almost always somebody else that is already on the list. Typically, the teacher of record signs as the instructional strategist as well. And then if it is an initial case conference, you're going to have somebody that was part of that evaluation team, usually your psychologist or your speech language pathologist that is a required member and will need to stay the whole time too. If not, then we have to get that parent written consent prior to the meeting. Now that's difficult because we get that through the notice of conference. There's a place for us to check. Hey, I think the gen ed teacher may miss part of this meeting, meaning we'd like to get this person back into their classroom after they've shared some information. If you're going to do that, there's a place to check, and then the parent can sign that they give permission. But we know most of those notices of case conference don't ever make it back to school. Like, I don't think a lot of parents understand that we want them to send it back, right? So your teachers of record typically show up with an extra copy so that before the meeting even gets started, we say, hey, you forgot to send this back, or it never got to me. Do you mind signing this again? And remember, I asked you if this person could leave. Is that still okay? If so, we get that in writing. Now, sometimes though, we have parents who they don't want to sign that. They don't want to give permission. They want those people to stay there. And if that's the case, we can't let someone leave. If they have to leave, right, then you have to think about, what are you going to do? You're probably going to table that conference and reschedule to finish it, or reschedule it altogether. But it's important that you have some sort of policy about how you're going to handle all this within the district. Another piece of the excusal is that if I'm being excused for part or all of the meeting, and I'm going to miss the part where I would be giving input into the IEP development, I need to give some of that in writing. We do have a teacher input sheet that is on the Padlet in the very far right column too, that you're welcome to use. You're welcome to use for ideas and make your own. But it's good to have that written input, especially for those of you who are at the secondary level, because you're not going to usually have all of a child's teachers come into a meeting. So you want to make sure everybody's getting to give some of their input too. So do with what you like on that sheet. And if not, just make sure you're always covering that written input piece. We do keep information confidential. That's really important. A lot of districts have kind of gotten burned by sharing information, and sometimes we don't think about this. Now, I had a parent one time that I was coming to a conference to be a facilitator, and I met her in the front office. We shook hands and I introduced myself, and she's like, can we not talk anymore until we get in the room? Okay, I wasn't even thinking about that, but just sharing who I was and what I was there for, and there were other people around, like school secretary, maybe a couple of kids, that was really violating things. And I had this parent call me out on it, and I was kind of glad she did, because it made me really think about, where do we have some of these conversations? Sometimes we talk with a teacher in the hallway and other people may be walking by. Sometimes we talk in a teacher's lounge and there are other teachers that really don't have a need to know that information that are nearby. So always really be thinking about that personally identifiable information. Because of this, we can't invite someone else outside of our district to be part of a case conference unless we have parent written consent. Now, it's a little different if a parent brings someone that's outside. They've taken care of all that on their own. We don't need to get additional consent there, because if a parent brings somebody, that's okay. But like, we can't invite vocational rehabilitation representatives or an outside, maybe a case manager from mental health or something like that, without having written consent for that information. It also means that wherever we keep our any hard copies of an IEP, an IEP at a glance, any of that kind of stuff, that we keep that locked down. So I think it's really great when we share information, for example, with our paraprofessionals, but they need to have a good understanding of, you can't just leave this folder of IEPs at a glance laying around in random places, right? It's either with you or it's in a locked cabinet. So sharing that information is really important. Okay, I'm going to talk just a little bit about the public agency representative. And again, I think a lot of you are serving in that role as a case conference member. Again, you are always a required member, so you would need a formal excusal in order to leave the meeting for even part of it. And that's hard. because many of you are also the emergency person, right? You got the walkie-talkie and suddenly there's a fight in the cafeteria, or suddenly, oh my gosh, the buses came early, or, all of that kind of stuff pulls your attention from the meeting. And in order to make it legal to leave at all, you would either need to take a quick break. Can we take a 5-minute break on this meeting and let me go do my thing? Or it would need to have been excused from the parent prior to the meeting starting. In order to serve in that role of a public agency representative, you have to meet 3 criteria. So one, you have to know what's going on so that you can know about the different resources that are available in your district and have the authority to commit them, which means you have the say-so within a meeting. If you are serving as a public agency representative, there can never be a situation where you say, oh, I can't make that call. I can't make that decision. We're going to have to wait and consult the bigwigs on this. You are the bigwig. During that meeting, if you have been authorized as a public agency representative, then that's why we get information before the conference to maybe know what to expect, that we've collected data, and that we're ready to make those kinds of determinations at meetings. You also have to be qualified to either provide specially designed instruction or to supervise the provision of specially designed instruction. And I think for most of you, it's not that you have a special ed background, some of you do, but for many of you, it's that I'm qualified as an administrator to supervise special education. And then it's important that that person also have a really good understanding of the gen ed curriculum and what's happening in the gen ed world, because they can't exist without the other. Everything that we do in special education is based on its connection to what's happening in general education. So for most of you, you're going to meet those criteria, right? Most building administrators, district administrators you naturally kind of fit based on what you do. Designees can be harder because many of you know that you have more meetings that happen than you have bodies to cover them as a public agency representative when you're already spread really thin. But you have to think really carefully about who else within your building is identified as a designee, because they have to meet those 3 criteria or technically it's not legal. Whoops. So many of you may have your counselors. Some counselors, I think, are very qualified in that role and some not so much. So you've got to think about that individual person, not necessarily the title. Special ed coordinators typically would have the experience in the background to be able to meet those things. Just really think about it. Really think about who you put in those roles. But usually building administrators, assistant principals, deans, those kind of people will fit in that role pretty well. Other people within that case conference, we've got teachers of record who have the license to cover a student, and then anybody else who's actually serving that student is a teacher of service. Gen ed teacher is very important. Even if the student is not spending a lot of time in the general education environment, they provide just a different lens. Gen ed teachers bring knowledge of the curriculum. They bring a really good comparison to typical, right? So sometimes when we think, oh, this kid is making great progress, and we lose sight of the fact that they may have a huge gap between what's happening with typical peers and what's happening with the student. And I think gen ed teachers just bring that good perspective. The instructional strategist, again, that's typically somebody else who's also marking as instructional strategist. And that is just somebody who has the ability to take whatever data we have, testing, whether it was an evaluation or it's, our district level testing or looking at iLearn results or things like that. And what do we do with this now when it comes to the IEP? So teachers of record do a good job with this. If you have somebody who has done an evaluation, they are probably going to mark themselves as the instructional strategist. And then having somebody be a good note taker. Make sure you have somebody actually taking notes. If you don't, you may walk away from a meeting and find that no one has taken notes, and that's always a problem. Again, on the Padlet, in the far right column, there under meeting resources, there is actually a couple of examples of what your IEP notes might look like, to make sure that we're not just rewriting the IEP in the notes section, but we are explaining, how did we get there? Like, what was the conversation around those big decisions and changes? Parent is always an important role at the meeting. Part of what the law says is we need to make sure they have meaningful participation. They're not sitting there quietly. They're not just being given a copy of the IEP to say, look it over and sign it. That we are listening to their input. We don't necessarily always have to agree to everything that they're asking for, but we have to consider all of that. And the first step in that is getting them to the meetings. So part of what the law says, again, is you got to have multiple and varied attempts at getting a parent there. So it could mean, 3-4 times of trying to contact them, but making sure that we vary that up. So if I make a phone call and I get nothing, I don't just stick with the phone call because it wasn't effective the first time. So maybe I try an email, I try a phone call, I try waiting in the pickup line to give the parent information or to make contact with them. But multiple and varied is what it's asking for. The biggest thing is document. Every single time we make contact like that, it's important to document it. If we don't document it, it's as if it didn't happen when if anything ever get called into question or would get pulled into a court kind of situation. We definitely want to have good documentation. We want to make sure that every time we meet, we are meeting and we are making decisions within that conference. So if we make decisions without bringing in parent input, or we're making decisions outside of a case conference meeting and just bringing those firm decisions into the meeting to present them, it is predetermination. We've had a lot of time over the years spent with Julie Weatherly, and Julie is a very prominent special education attorney, and she talks about predetermination as a fatal mistake, meaning it goes against everything we know about a free, appropriate public education. And if you engage in predetermination, you will lose in court. So this is something we never want to do. So documenting things in your notes, documenting your contact with parents, making sure that if we come in with a draft IEP, that it truly is a draft, meaning we're going to make some changes along the way. We're going to discuss things and modify this so that it looks different than when we went in. It's okay to have pre-meetings. It's okay to do some strategic planning. It's not okay to say we're all going to stand firm on this and nobody's going to back down, right? That we still go in with multiple options and we listen to the parents' input. Part of getting parents involved is making sure that we always hold case conferences at a mutually agreed upon time and place. And the best thing to do is just early warning of these things, making sure that we talk about these ahead of time. We get some parent input about when we're going to have the meetings, and that we offer some flexibility, meaning it can't just be at 12 o'clock because that's when a teacher's prep time is. we look at the parent schedule, we try to work around that, but we have to agree to it as well. So I'm not meeting on a Saturday morning at 8 o'clock. That's just not going to happen in my world. And I don't think the rest of staff would want to do that as well. So mutually agreed upon is kind of the key here. And always making sure that parents know that they are part of the team. They are a case conference committee member. They're not just a recipient of that discussion. When we talk about placement within an IEP, we know that we're always thinking about the general education setting as our first thought. Can we make it happen there? Can we put a little bit more support and services and make it happen there? Students have a right to be in with their peers if at all possible. We have some students that for various reasons, it's not quite as possible. So we have to make sure that, that we're always considering that first. And that if that can't happen, that, and I'm going to show you this next graphic too, if that can't happen, that we don't make huge jumps along this continuum of least restrictive environment. That if the gen ed classroom isn't appropriate, we think about maybe some pull-out services before we jump to self-contained, before we jump to separate school, residential, homebound. These are big jumps. So just making sure that we always go back to that mindset of, could we do it here first? So every time that we interact with parents, we know that that's an opportunity for us to build relationships, and quite frankly, to market our school as this is the place to be. You can trust us. We're wanting to do the right thing. It's also important that we know that every person who comes to that table should have a role, and it really falls back on us to kind of train our own staff as to what their role is, what the expectations are. They're not a warm body. They're there because they have input. And if not, we should replace them with somebody else. For you all as administrators, you are more about the process of the meeting, making sure it flows, making sure things happen, that you're controlling kind of that conversation along the way, as opposed to the content of developing the goals, developing the services, knowing most of the things about the student. That usually comes from the parent and the teachers and the service providers. But having somebody who can manage the process so that the teacher of record doesn't have to can make a huge difference on just how well that meeting flows. All right, we don't have a whole lot of time, but we're going to jump into behaviors and manifestations, and then I will stick around a little bit longer if there are some additional questions about these. So just starting with thinking about behaviors, the first thing to do is think, can we prevent them, right? We don't want them to happen in the first place. So having a good, solid tier 1 support for behavior and mental wellness is really important. Making sure if there are huge needs in your school, you're addressing them on that ground level. We're adjusting the rules. We're adjusting minutes for passing periods. We're adding more supervision to the playground. Whatever it is that we need, we're putting that preventative piece in for all students. We also know that if we have good solid supports at a tier 2 and tier 3 level for those smaller groups of students who need them, we're going to be able to prevent a lot of things. We may have grief support groups. We may have social skills instruction groups, things like that that can help with the behavioral piece. Really focus on the behavior or the relationships. So focus on teachers and other staff having good relationships with parents, having good relationships with students. One really strong intervention that we can do with students that need to have a good relationship with an adult is just that 2x10 procedure. It's an evidence-based strategy. Take 2 minutes for 10 days in a row and just have a casual conversation with a student. Go out of your way to have a 2-minute conversation with a student, not about what their goal is for the day or, how's your behavior going to be or things like that. It could be about anything. The student may want to talk about the basketball game. They may want to talk about their pet. They may want to talk about Minecraft. It doesn't matter what it is. It's about forming that relationship. Also thinking relationship wise, could you provide support instead of an office referral? So if you can eliminate office referrals in your building to say, do not send a kid to the office. If you have a concern that would rise to that level, call me. I'll come cover your classroom for 5 minutes. You take the student out and have a conversation. Building that relationship as opposed to just, having an administrative conversation with the student and then sending them right back without the teacher really knowing even what happened. Really think about consequences that would focus on instruction. How can I teach something? So let's talk a little bit about the discipline. I must have went backwards. Okay. Another piece of prevention is really thinking, let's prevent getting out of compliance for things. So we've got to communicate well. We've got to make sure everybody knows what they're doing. And we've got to make sure everybody understands what a removal means. So we'll talk about removals here in just a minute. So kind of hold that thought. Now, when a behavior happens, rather than just cracking the handbook and saying, okay, what's the consequence for this behavior? If we really get into some questioning, we're more likely to have an impact on the behavior in the future. So what's going on? Can we change something in the environment? Is this kid always sitting next to somebody who's a trigger? Was the adult the trigger? Is this room really hot every day at 2 o'clock? It's blazing hot in there. Does the student have a plan? Did we follow the plan? Because sometimes that's an issue. And then thinking about things like, does the student even have the skill to be able to do what we're asking? Do they have the skill here, but they can't do it when they're stressed, when they're tired, when they're hungry? Lots of things that we could ask questions about. We also want to think about, was there any impact from the behavior that we need to essentially address or fix, right? Is there a relationship that's damaged? What's their property damage? Is the bathroom wall disgusting, right? Whatever it is, we've got to fix those things. Part of those consequences teach a whole lot more than a typical removal of you go home for a day. I don't usually learn a whole lot by that. Okay, so I said we'd get back to removals. Removals are what Article 7 really refers to. When it's talking about counting up the amount of time basically that a student is out of school, away from their peers as a disciplinary consequence. So if you remove a student for any part of a day, that has to be counted as a full day of removal. If I get sent home for a half day or for the last hour of school where we call and say, Dad, can you just pick Johnny up because, it's been a rough day, that is a full day of removal. So avoid that at all costs because you need to protect those 10 days because the 10 days that we have that aren't as much of a concern, quite honestly, they're used for respite, right? They're used to make sure that we don't lose this teacher because she needed a day off from this student. They're usually not about just consequences. So we want to use those very sparingly. The difference is sometimes we have an IEP that is written in such a way that a short-term removal might happen as part of that behavior plan for a student, where we've gone through a certain number of steps. And at this point, we just know that the student is spent for the day. And those do not have to be counted, but those are really rare to see in a behavior plan. We just know we have a few students who kind of hit that point to where things are just going to go from bad to worse if we don't remove them from the situation. Suspension, expulsion, those are counted as days of removal. In school could be a removal. It depends on the situation. If we have a student in an in-school suspension, but they are able to continue to make progress in the gen ed curriculum, meaning I get to work on my work and I get all my special ed services, and I'm participating with non-disabled students to the same extent I would in my current placement, then we don't have to count this. So that's hard to do, though. It's hard for your special ed teachers to make this happen. And it's hard if you're in a building where typically you only have one kid in school suspension, because then I'm isolated. What this really means is we don't want special ed in school suspension and gen ed in school suspension. It all needs to be together. And we need to make sure kids get what they need. So if I'm normally going to get speech therapy, you can have the speech therapist come down and work with the student, or you can have the student be released from ISS to go get their speech and then come back. You know, however you need to do that to make it happen, and for a kid to get everything they need throughout the day, then we wouldn't have to count that as a removal. Transportation, if a student rides a regular ed bus, then a bus suspension is not a removal. If a student rides a special education bus that's on their IEP, then if they happen to get kicked off that bus for however many days, then we have to provide alternate transportation, which could mean another bus, the van, resource officer, Uber, however you want to do this, or paying the parent mileage to bring the student back and forth. Those would be alternative transportations. If not, then that student has to be counted as removals, because we're removing them from some of the things that we promised basically on the IEP. So when we talk about a change of placement, in this case, we're not talking about us getting together and changing a student's placement on an IEP. A disciplinary change of placement means I've been removed from school so much that it's as if we had changed placement. So when they talk about a disciplinary change of placement, if a student has been out for more than 10 days in a row, then that automatically it is definitely a disciplinary change of placement. If a student is removed for more than 10 cumulative days across the school year, then it might be a change of placement. And really it's left for the public agency to decide. But I will tell you that almost all districts that I've ever been in have just decided, yeah, we're not willing to take a chance of being wrong in how we call it. And so they just say more than 10 days, it's a change of placement, whether it was in a row or cumulative. But look to your own policies and procedures to figure out what to do there. Now, with the change of placement, when we've said, okay, we're to that point, number one, we have to send another copy of the notice of procedural safeguards to the parents on the day that we make that decision. That's not necessarily the day that the infraction occurred, right? Maybe I got in a fight on a Wednesday, and Thursday, you all are watching the videos, you're interviewing witnesses, right? You're trying to make good sense of what happens. And it's not until the end of the day on that day that you make the decision that this is going to result in these many days out. It's the date you make that decision that triggers the timelines from here on out. So you have to give a copy of the notice of procedural safeguards. If it can't happen on that day, they have to be mailed the next business day. And then we have to schedule and hold a manifestation determination conference within 10 instructional days of the decision. So again, not of the behavior that occurred, but of the decision that was made to hand down that discipline that's going to tip me over that 10-day line. So just a little bit about manifestation determinations. It is something that is like any other case conference, which means the whole committee is trying to come to consensus on this, and they're using data to make decisions. So it's an evaluative process, meaning we're going to look at all the data that we have, and the whole committee gets to weigh in on this. We are always trying to build consensus. But the bottom line is, at any meeting, when you are serving as the public agency representative, if we can't come to consensus, something that everyone can live with as far as the end result, then it falls back on you to make the offer of service of what's going to be in that IEP. So we're using the information to determine whether or not the student's behavior was caused by their disability or had a very concrete link to that disability. Or could it also be that it was because somebody dropped the ball and wasn't implementing the IEP? We have to look at all those things. So we're going to review information in order to figure this out. And when we do, part of that is looking a little bit around what happened with the behavior. What was the incident about? It's really important that we dig deep into what are the characteristics of the student's disability. Because again, every student's disability is different. My learning disability is going to be different from yours. Even if we say, okay, we've got two students, they're both identified as other health impaired. One could be ADHD, one could be leukemia, right? Very, very different. And even if we say, I have ADHD, some kids with ADHD are very impulsive. Some are not impulsive at all. They're just very inattentive. It has to do with truly what have we determined are the characteristics of my disability. We also have to think about, did I already have a plan, and were we implementing that plan? And was it a good plan? Was it appropriate? Now, if we look at all this information, when we say yes to either of those questions up in the corner, then it is a manifestation of the student's disability. Now, if what happened is because we didn't implement the IEP, then we need to fix that right away. We need to figure out what was causing us not to implement the IEP and how are we going to remedy that situation. So when we say that, yes, there's a connection, it was a manifestation, we have to make sure that we conduct a functional behavioral assessment and get a behavior plan in place. Sometimes we already have those. In most situations, I think we already have those. And if so, we need to take a good look at them and see, are they still appropriate? Do we need to update them? Do we need to make some changes? Then we have to return the student back to the placement that they came from, because it's not fair to make changes on them when something was related to their disability. Now, the exception to this is when we all agree. So parents really have to be on board if we're going to do this. If the parents agree that we're going to make some changes to the behavior plan, and because of those changes, we need to make a change of placement, then we can make that change, but only when a parent is on board with that. When something happens that was just a bad choice, and it is not a manifestation of the student's disability. I had a learning disability and I brought a bag of marijuana to school. Yeah, probably not connected, right? In most cases. We can proceed with the same discipline we would for any other student. When this happens, though, we have to make sure that we put in place services for any student who is removed for a longer period of time than those 10 days, that include whatever is needed in order for me to keep making progress in the gen ed curriculum, to keep working on my goals and making progress towards those. And it's important that we also think about, are there behavioral things that need to happen so that when I do come back, I'm better than I was, right? That we're not going to come back and have the same behavior occur again. So sometimes that is direct instruction of behavior. Sometimes that's putting a good behavior plan in place. It's whatever the committee determines is appropriate. All right. A couple of exceptions to this, again, are those big ones: drugs, weapons, controlled substances, or inflicting serious bodily injury upon another person. In those situations, we're still going to have a manifestation meeting, but it doesn't matter what the outcome is. We can have the option to remove a student to an interim alternative educational setting for up to 45 school days. So again, we're gonna make sure that we're keeping everyone safe in these situations. So just a couple of more things. We're not going to be able to get to all of this, but thinking about, okay, make sure your teachers are prepared for what to bring to the meeting. And then sometimes we end up right back there, right? We hold a meeting and the next week the student gets in trouble for something else that would normally warrant a removal. Well, let's think about this. Do we want to sit down at another manifestation? Because if you're going for a removal, you have to. The clock does not reset until the next school year. So let's look at those previous decisions and see, are there things that we could do instead? Because if I know what the outcome of the meeting is going to be, let's not go there. Let's think about something else instead of a removal, because a removal probably didn't work before, or we wouldn't be back here. Okay, I want to recognize that it is 5:30. I do have a little bit more to cover. I'm inviting you to stay on if you want, but I know that's hard for people. We are recording this, and you will get a copy of this sent to you, the recording. So if you need to log off, I certainly understand, but I'm going to keep talking for maybe another 5 minutes. I just wanted to warn you on that. Now, you have a little bit more flexibility when you're meeting and it's not a manifestation. So if I can say, you know what, normally I would hand down 2 days for this, let's not do that. Instead, let's hold a meeting that's not a manifestation, and let's talk about, do we need a change of placement? Do we need to increase services? What do we need to do so that we aren't constantly coming back and having these issues? So remembering that those first 10 days that students are out, that we don't have to do anything unless we do something for everybody else, for all of our students. But after 10 days, from day 11 on, we have to figure out what kind of services a student needs anytime that they're removed from school. That's part of what's included in parent rights. So to kind of pull the behavior piece together, remember that if we can predict a behavior, we can usually get in front of it and prevent it. And that's what we really want to do. And part of that is around forming those good relationships. That makes a big difference. In order for us to stay compliant and to make sure that we're meeting all these different timelines within the behavior piece, communication among staff is key. It really is. Making sure everybody understands that time is of the essence when we're working on this stuff. And every day that a kid is not in school is a missed opportunity for us to teach them something. Most behaviors are either that I don't have the skill to do it, and I need to be taught, or I can tell you exactly the right thing to do, but I couldn't do it in the moment because I'm not fluent. It's not my go-to, right? It's back here somewhere, but it's not my automatic response. And those are things that we need to build that good behavioral fluency. So as we kind of pull this together, and then I will answer Trisha's question, just things that you can look for within your building. I mean, I think most of you are not here because you think your building is in terrible shape. You're here because you think things are good and you want them to be just a little bit better and maybe a little bit more compliant. So when you see that all students are growing and that you don't have pockets that aren't, something's going right. When you see your staff getting stronger at, how they do things, that's a sign that something good is happening. When we are working together, when we're working with parents, when we get good parent involvement and communication, we know we're doing something right. Making sure that we've got good direct instruction to address any of the needs, not just the academic needs. We've got procedures in place to keep us compliant, and that every time we walk out of a case conference, things are good, right? I love it when I can walk out of a case conference and feel like we accomplished something, we celebrated something, as opposed to I'm worn out. I need to go take a nap. I need something, right? And I think sometimes we walk out of those case conferences feeling just depleted. When we can see those good meetings, we know we're doing something right. So just think about one little thing that you could do, something to increase relationships, something that you could change at the next case conference to make it even stronger than it is, and a long-term goal for your building to try and make it more and more inclusive. Just the final thing, we do have the scan on the left. You can take your phone and scan it, or you can go to the link. But this is just a quick evaluation. We will send this to you as well in an email, and we'll make sure that you get your certificate for participation points or professional growth points. I want to look at the questions really quickly. Behavior plans, it is not a removal if the steps are written into the plan, right? So it's not just, that could be short-term removals, or even, I mean, I'm thinking of students who are like, sometimes we write behavior plans for a student who even has some medical needs, where if we hit a certain point and the strategies have not worked, they're going to need to spend the rest of the day in the sensory room napping, right? Or sometimes it's just, if we hit this certain point, we know that the parent needs to be called to maybe come and get them. But again, I think that is a behavior plan that is the exception and not the rule. Like you're going to see very specific, concrete things that we know, like it's going to escalate further if we keep the kid here when we hit a certain point. Resources or intervention guides. That is a great question. And we've got some really good resources in some of our other Padlets. I'll tell you what, I will add a column to the Padlet that adds in some behavior resources that might be helpful, especially for those bigger behaviors, because I think that's what you're saying is, you know, like the really big things, we need to get in front of those, and those are the most difficult to address. So I will add that in, and you should be able to, I'm not sure, I think I can get to it tomorrow, and that may help to provide a few extra things. All right, well, thank you guys for hanging with me. I know this was long, so I appreciate all your time, and look for an email in the next couple of days to get all of this information together with your certificate and evaluation.